John O'Neill, and I'm the director of the Political Economy Centre, which set this up. Dan has told me to do an advert for our next event before we start, which is Wolfgang Street, Straw Street, who's coming to talk about taking back control on December the 6th. That's about democracy and capitalism. But I'm delighted we're having this event tonight. It's great that you could come out on Sunday night. It was the only time that Molly Scott-Cato could make it, so we wanted to do it at a time when she could do it, so we could get that political dimension to it. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I mean, this event partly had its origin in some really fruitful disagreements I had with Bob. Hello, Bob. So I really wanted to get a whole group of people in the same room having this conversation. So we were having a discussion about degrowth. Bob has just got a paper on this. If you left review, if people want to look at that. There's Giorgos Kallis, who's coming in from Spain. So hello, Giorgos.
Hello.
And then here we have Kevin Anderson and Molly Scott-Cato, and it's to be shared by Maeve Cohen, who is the director of Rethinking Economics and was a wonderful student of mine who was really important in the Co2 Economic Society. So she's been really a pivotal figure in taking kind of alternative thinking about economics forward. So thanks for sharing this, Maeve, and I'll pass it over to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. That's lovely. Yeah, I used to study here at the University of Manchester, and in fact, in this very room in 2012, we, the Post-Crash Economics Society, hosted our first ever event looking at whether or not economics graduates were fit for purpose. For those of you not familiar with Rethinking Economics, we're a student-led campaign to reform economics education. Our economic common sense is what is created in the halls of these universities, not just Manchester, internationally across the world. There is a form of economics that is being taught as the way to do economics, and this whole event is discussing whether or not that way of doing economics is sustainable. So I am not going to talk anymore because there's more interesting people with more to say on it than me, and so I'm going to straight away pass over to Professor Kevin Anderson. So okay. Welcome.
Thank you very much. The screen's going to be changed over. Oh, excellent. Right. Oh, good technical glitch. I'm getting the thumbs up. Right. Okay. I'm going to be trying to just use my understanding of the science of climate change. I'm focusing specifically on climate change. I'm not talking about the broader issues of sustainability. Of climate change. I'm characterizing that by what was captured in the Paris Agreement, which I'm pretty sure if you all come out on Sunday night to listen to this sort of debate, you're fairly familiar with. So I call it Paris versus growth with a question mark, 2 degrees centigrade, maths and equity. And I've sort of stripped away all my interests that I have in the sort of the political domain, the cultural domain and the social domain and tried to give it more of a sort of scientific flavor. But hopefully other things come out later. But I thought I'd start with a quick thought experiment. Imagine, and obviously this is clearly not the case, but imagine that we thought climate change was a serious existential threat. Imagine that we actually genuinely thought that was the case, and that we regulated to force the top 10% of global emitters to reduce their emissions to the level of the average European citizen, and the other 90% do nothing, just carry on as normal. Then that is a 1/3 cut in global carbon dioxide emissions, with just 10% of the population reducing just to the level of the average European, which anyway is far too high. And that's a 1/3 cut. You look at all the pledges made in Paris, they add up to no change by 2030. And I think you could do that if we felt climate change was serious, you could do that probably in 6 months to a year. And I'm going to come back to that later. My provocation is that the rapidly dwindling 1.5 and 2 degrees C carbon budgets, aligned with our emission responsibilities, which I'll come back to later, embed equity at the heart of any real mitigation agenda. It's not that I think equity is a good or a bad thing. I do have my views on that. But I just think it comes out of the maths in 2018. And there are two taboo issues which underpin our ongoing and catastrophic failure to tackle climate change. First, the massive asymmetric distribution of wealth. Whether we think that's a good or a bad thing, you can have your own judgments on that, but it's not compatible, I would argue, with climate change, responding to climate change. And second, that we cannot question that economic growth must be challenged. It's an immutable issue. It's more important than physics. Only when the debate opens up to include inequality and question the concept of economic growth will we actually be sufficiently mature to move from incrementalism, which is all we've done on climate change so far, to system-level change. My hypothesis is that incremental mitigation, a bit of maths here, equals high climate change impact, and that means you can't have economic growth. Similarly, Paris plus science plus maths tells us you can't have aggregate economic growth, so it can't be part of the future, however you may see climate change. And that Paris plus science plus maths means we need some sort of post-growth agenda, however we may describe that, plus equity. And without the equity, you still can't address the challenges in the Paris Agreement. How far removed is this from where we are today? Well, I would argue this is still the framing of the world that we have. Our universities are based on this, our academic communities are based on this, most of modern society is based on this. It's still the Davos fraternity, and that sort of way of viewing the world still dominates, sadly, in my view. And the response we're seeing from this is steady as she goes. We've had the banking crisis and quantitative easing and so forth. Let's get things just back on track again. Maintains the dominant socioeconomic paradigm, continued growth of resources and power skewed to privileged few. And I'm trying to say all of this at the moment, whether it's good or bad, is almost irrelevant to my argument here. And on climate, I would argue the whole Davos paradigm is legitimized by a group I deliberately pejoratively call the climate glitterati, whether that's Mark Carney, Adair Turner, John Gummer, Nick Stern, Christiana Figueres, Michael Bloomberg, Al Gore, DiCaprio, and all the others who have massive carbon footprints and ask other small people to reduce their carbon. I think that's a disgrace, and it's actually undermined any real action. But they're supported by a whole cadre of climate academics, usually grey-haired male professors, who want to sort of cuddle up to this group. And so they come up with every sort of scam they can to make sure we don't question Davos, whether it's offsetting negative emissions, geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, green growth, and all the other stuff. Now, these things themselves may have some validity, but they're being used to mean actually just incremental evolution within the system. So we are developing policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. Let's put some bones on this provocation. What did the IPCC tell us about Paris? I'm condensing the whole of the IPCC into one line here, which is probably a bit unfair. And I'm talking about the mitigation side. It's carbon budgets that matter. The total amount of carbon dioxide that we pump in the atmosphere from now out to forever relates to the temperature. So that's what matters. It's not long-term targets. They have nothing to do with climate change. Never have done. And we have to also be honest, I think, to start to recognize where we are. You can't solve a problem if you don't accept where you are today. And I would argue on climate change, we haven't accepted it for the last 20-odd years. First IPCC report, 1990, and as I look around here, and I regularly say this, quite a few of you here, your parents hadn't met, you hadn't been conceived when we had the first IPCC report. 28 years later, or 27 years later, last year, emissions were over 65%, almost 65% higher, I should say, compared with 1990. And they went up by 1.5% last year. Almost certainly they're going to go up again this year, almost certainly. So despite optimistic rhetoric, grinning academics telling us about how technology is going to solve the problem for us or some carbon tax nonsense, we've had 28 years of abject failure on climate change. 28 years. So if you're younger than 28 or so, you should be really angry at your parents. Just look at and be constructive as well. Just look at the UK. We like to blame China or India because it's all these people abroad that are doing all this in the poor parts of the world. Well, we have an international reputation for leading on climate change, and so does Sweden, Denmark, or France. And yet, for all of these countries, if you include aviation and shipping and imports and exports, there is no reduction from these supposedly climate progressive countries since 1990. So we have chosen to do absolutely nothing for 28 years. So the question that I think that they need to answer before I can then sort of come to a conclusion on whether climate change is compatible with economic growth, if you like, are the carbon budgets really so small and our emissions really skewed towards just a few people? Well, the energy budget, I'm cutting away all the maths and the science behind it, we have about 550 billion tons of carbon dioxide we can emit into the atmosphere from now to forever if we're going to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, which will kill lots of people around the world anyway, as the recent report points out. They'll be poor, they'll be low emitters, they'll be a long way from here, and they'll typically be non-white. But we've never cared about them before. So why do we care now? Well, we also think it's going to affect us as well. So about 550 billion tons, that's about 15 years of current emissions. 15 years. But then you take it down to the OECD, And that plays out, and I've taken all the reasoning behind this, which you can ask me about later if you want, 10 to 20% reductions in emissions every single year starting at the beginning of this year. If you're the US or the UK, you're probably nearer the 15 to 20% mark. If you're Greece, you're probably nearer the 10%. Every single year starting now. That's zero carbon energy by 2035 to 2040 and about an 80% reduction by 2030. This is for 2 degrees centigrade of warming, not for 1.5. Okay. So there's hardly any carbon budget left. The second question is CO2 really skewed towards the few? Well, you'll all be probably fairly familiar with Chancellor Piketty's work in 2015, and this sort of captures really quite well the activities of the world relative to their global income deciles. And as we're not too surprised, perhaps, is that most emissions relate to the activities of just a few people. And very broadly, 50% of the CO2 comes 10% of the population, which is what my opening experiment was about, and 70% comes from 20% of the population. You can't squeeze the emissions out of people that don't emit. So budgets and inequality, carbon budgets and inequality, I would argue, dictate a three-phase strategy. First, we need profound changes in the behaviors and practices of high energy users, because that gets us off the curve the quickest. You cannot do it with technology. The second, you need very, very stringent energy efficiency standards on all appliances, and you have to have policies to address the rebound effect, which people spend the money that they save on jet skis and holidays. And then we need to have a Marshall-style reconstruction of our energy system, like the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War, that sort of size that needs to start immediately, but that will take 3 decades, 2 to 3 decades to put in place. Delivering 2 and 3, these two here, requires the labours and resources to provide the luxuries for professors and other people in number 1. So it is akin to a shift in the productive capacity of society, similar to that in World War II. Just to give a feel for that, that means things like this, that we all aspire to: large homes, holiday homes, multiple cars, SUVs, being the mobile elite with business and first class, regular use of taxis, indulgent celebrations, going abroad to have weddings and anniversaries, all that nonsense, and high levels of consumer goods. All of the labour and resources required for this are required to make that most Marshall-style transition from what is a fossil fuel industry to infrastructure to a zero carbon one, and that's got to be done in the next 2 to 3 decades. So it's not a socialist argument; it's a maths argument. You cannot use resources in that here. A zero carbon industrial strategy. So QED, 2 degrees centigrade, science and maths demand a post-growth agenda with equity at its core. So I think that was it. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you. Sorry, moving about. I wanted to see your slides. Excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to let everyone speak and then we'll ask some questions. So next up is Professor Robert Pollin, and he's a Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and he joins us on the line. So over to you.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. As you can see, you can see that I'm old gray-haired professor that energy talking about. I don't think I would wish to be one of those global carbon companies, carbon blue or odd. Let me try to make use of my thinking that my new opinion, but also like to focus on the question of CO2 emissions and climate change. And what I think we propose is a program for eliminating in 40 to 50 years. CO2 emissions today are around 32 billion tons. The International Energy forecast that if proceeds on our current forecast, CO2 emissions will rise to 43 billion tons from 32. Even under the Paris Agreement. youth are at rough parity fossil fuels.
Brilliant, thank you so much for your contribution. So next we have Professor Giorgos Kallis. He's an environmental scientist at the, excuse my pronunciation here, Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, working on ecological and political ecology. So over to you, Giorgos.
People are being so good on time. I'm going to try to be good.
Okay, thank you so much. And lastly, we have, but not leastly, we have Molly Scott-Cato, who is an MEP for South West England for the Green Party, and prior to that, she was a professor of strategy and sustainability at the University of Roehampton. So over to you, Molly.
Thank you very much. So I've got 10 minutes. I'm going to spend 5 minutes explaining some work I'm doing now in the European Parliament, trying to make capitalism sustainable. Oh, it's always like this. I have to, unless I look like this, you can't see me. So I'm going to hold this. And then I'm going to spend the other 5 minutes talking about 3 things with capitalism that I think make it unsustainable. We can talk about that more in the discussion then. Oh, that didn't work. What am I doing wrong? That worked for you, didn't it?
Oh, that's what we did in computer.
Ah, okay. So anyway, the next one's a picture, so we can go through that one. So sustainable finance is about shifting money away from unsustainable investments and towards sustainable investments. And have I got to be there to do it? Ah, it's working now, thanks. So there's quite a lot of bits of it, but the most important thing is getting information to investors. You probably know about divestment. Divestment is like a tiny voluntary part of this, but this is about mandatory legal requirements for everybody in the European Union to effectively make that shift from unsustainable to sustainable investments. So the first thing is disclosure. That means that you know what happens to your money. Most people in this room who have savings or a pension fund don't know what that money's doing. And if you went to your bank or building society or insurance company, they probably wouldn't know what that money's doing. They chuck it into a big fund. Some of it, a tiny part does good stuff. An awful lot of it does stuff like investments in palm oil plantations, things you'd be horrified to find out about. So what we're insisting is that all finance companies communicate what's happening to your money right down to the point where they invest it in a comprehensible way right up to you when you go in and buy that product. That will in itself, I believe, make a huge difference, because the reason they don't tell you is because you would shift your money if you knew. So, yeah, that's basically making the same information. This is extraordinary. I mean, one of the key principles of market economics is that customers have perfect information. But when I've talked to banks and building societies about this, they can't give you that perfect information. They actually don't know. And half the people in the Parliament think you don't have a right to know either. But I think we're going to win this one. We're voting on this one tomorrow, actually. And I think we're going to get mandatory disclosure for all financial assets, which will really start to make a huge difference, I think. Thank you. There is some good political stuff happening, really. I've got to stop Brexit, though, as well, obviously. And this is just like, this is my master plan for how sustainable finance might work, because essentially we've got the power to decide what's a viable asset, because we are responsible for the regulation of the financial system, but we're also deciding what kind of assets have value, because we will eliminate some things by making them illegal. So if we take the simplest example of this, we have a new regulation coming in 2021 which says you cannot put into mobile phones metals that were dug up in conflict zones, mainly in the Congo, and that fuel conflict. So that's a law that changes, and therefore anybody who's making those kind of products, their asset will become valueless. So I've made that amber now, and then it'll go into red. So you won't be able to hold that asset in your portfolio after January 2021. If you're holding renewable energy assets, they're green and fantastic already, so they're going to have value right the way through. But the interesting ones are the ones that need to make a transition. Now, at the moment, we're saying no fossil emissions after 2030. Obviously, that's far too late. But even so, that sent out a warning signal to fossil fuel companies that they have to start shifting their money out of fossil fuels. And they are doing that. And interestingly, when I meet the finance people to talk about this, they are really up for this agenda because they want clear signalling about what will have a value for them in the future. Especially the pension funds who are worried about the long term, and the insurance companies who are already bearing the brunt of climate change and know that we've got to address this urgently. Yeah, I don't think I need to talk about intensifying. I'll probably finish in 5 minutes now because I'm rushing along so much. But anyway, so these are the important questions. Why does capitalism act in this crazy way? And is there anything we can do to stop it? I mean, in a way, it's a theoretical question, is capitalism sustainable? Because I think if we change the way capitalism works enough, we might, we could then argue about whether it was fair in terms of profits and whether people should own the means of production and those things. But if it wasn't continuing to trash the planet, those theoretical discussions could carry on. So I'm more interested in adapting the system than I am in theoretically defining whether it's still capitalism or not. But look, this goes back to what Giorgos was talking about earlier, and also Robert, which is to say that if capitalism stops growing, it goes into recession. It has an upward spiral or a downward spiral. And the last time it had a really significant downward spiral and there wasn't intervention, as there was in the 2008 recession, we had the Great Depression. And that totally freaked everybody out because it was just causing massive social and economic dislocation, and that resulted in political dislocation and eventually in the war. So we don't want to go back down that track. That's the main reason people are concerned about the thought of the end of growth. This is just Keynes, by the way, with his Russian ballet dancer wife. But the reason I put them there is just to say that Keynes was the guy that figured out how to keep the whole system going by public investment and by creating demand. So failure of aggregate demand puts you down into what the economists call the death spiral, going downwards. But so if you don't do anything about it and you just stop growth, this is the kind of problem that economists are worrying about. So to get around that, they just invented the advertising industry, and they persuaded people, actually using psychological insights that came from the nephew or son-in-law of Freud, who learned all the stuff that Freud had to say about how if you make people think a car's like sex, then they'll buy a car, and essentially sold you loads of things you don't need. Now, this seems crazy retrospectively, now that we know we're crashing up against the planetary boundary, but at the time it seemed really sensible because it was stopping people being unemployed, so making you buy stuff you didn't need, and actually that also didn't make you happy. I like this word cathexis because this is about that thing of shifting one desire and turning it into another desire so that you think you're being satisfied. And that's basically why there's vast levels of mental illness. I think it's a key reason for it. Why you have to stroke your mobile phone instead of a cat. You know, it's not very good for you. But the point about advertising is it's trying to stimulate disease. It's not trying to satisfy your needs, because if it did, you'd stop buying stuff and the system would fail. This is a very important principle to understand. Could we run capitalism without that system? I think we could, but at the moment, this is what's keeping it going. Oh, we don't need that one. But we do need this one, because the important point to recognise here is that there is built-in obsolescence. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy fact. There's death dates on various pieces of equipment, again, so that you have to go and buy it again. And again, at the time that kind of idea came about, it wasn't as crazy as it seems to us now. The example of the Phoebus cartel is a great one. I think it was 1924. All the light bulb manufacturers got together and decided that a light bulb shouldn't last more than a fixed period, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to sell any more light bulbs. The oldest light bulb in the world is 105 years old, because it was designed in the early days before they made this agreement. Anyway, things have moved on now, and we've got longer-lasting light bulbs again, but it's just an example of how capitalism deliberately destroys products in order to make you buy new ones. So the second thing is interest rates. Now, nobody has successfully convinced me that the way we create money isn't creating this inbuilt and destructive pressure for growth. I still think it does. Other people disagree with me, but they haven't convinced me about this yet, because basically, if you're creating new money, as we do all the time, as banks do all the time, and when they create that money, it belongs to them, which is why being a bank is having a license to print money, literally. So when you do that, you are creating a future demand on goods. You create the money first, it then creates the economic growth later, so that you can sell the goods to repay the loan that was the way the money was created. So a money system based on debt and based on interest, I think, is one of the key drivers of why capitalism is always unsustainable. Also, the interest system is, coming back to what Kevin said, the interest system is one of the things that drives inequality. So people say, that's fine, we can manage that national debt. But effectively, what you're doing when you run your economy through a national debt is you are taking money from poor people who worked through their taxes and giving it to rich people who can afford to lend spare money. And that in itself is iniquitous. The system of interest-based money is creating inequality as well as unsustainability. Yeah, I said that. And lastly, discounting. The other thing is, the interest rate is also used in a sort of negative way to discount values. So when you're working out the costs and benefits, I read this bit because I get it wrong if I don't. When you're working out the costs and benefits of any economic policy or production process over time, the outcome depends entirely on the discount rate that you apply. The higher the discount rate, the lower the future cost of current actions. So however destructive something you do now, if you have an appropriate interest rate, you can just write that away over time, sort of wish it away. This happens with all sorts of destructive, environmentally destructive investments. If interest rates are relatively high, say 5 to 10%, then the cost of any actions you take today that have negative environmental impacts will just weigh very little today because you will have discounted them into the future. So the discount rate has has the effect of massively diminishing the present value of the distant future. And this is another key reason connecting to the interest rate, because the discount rate is based on the interest rate, and it's another key reason why we don't weigh heavily enough the environmental impacts we're causing now. And if we valued all future generations equally, then the discount rate would have to be 0 or even negative to reflect the fact that we've already done a lot of trashing of the planet. So this is another reason why I think having interest rates in the economy makes it impossible to be sustainable. That's all I wanted to say, apart from I just wanted to say Extinction Rebellion. Do get involved. It's really good fun. That's all.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. It's all, well, yeah, I mean, a lot of hope. I went to a talk the other day about a gentleman talking about climate change, and it was the most doom and gloom talk I've ever heard, and terrified me to not wanting to act in any way. So it's really good to hear some hopeful messages and some positivity. I think the sort of main tension that we came across in that is this idea of growth versus not growth, and if it's a sort of zero-sum game. If we are working towards degrowth, does it mean that we're going to have massive recessions, or is there different things that we can do to ensure that people's welfare is looked after as we stop growth? So I wonder if, Robert, would you like to begin with some comments on that, if possible? Thank you. Kevin, I can see you holding your head and getting very frustrated. I do think it's a very interesting point about the political challenge that we face, and we have to be able to bring people along with us. And it's very difficult to bring a population of people along with us when we have this inherent understanding of economics, like economic common sense talks about growth, and we all see growth as a good thing, and it is a difficult argument to win with a big population saying we need zero growth or forget about growth. So I really want to hear what you have to say, and if you could touch on that as well, that'd be really useful.
Well, I think the devil is actually in the detail here. I was in Scotland last week, and in fact, in an interview in the Scottish Herald today, which kind of captures my views on this. And probably other than the last few comments that Robert made, I was really sort of shaking my head in despair before, because I think environmental criteria is all about recession and austerity. And that's exactly what I want to bring about. Austerity and recession and reduction in material consumption by those of us who have abused the system for the last 30 to 50 years. So I want massive reductions in the material consumption of Robert. I mean, hoping when he's doing his traveling around the world recently, it's been virtual, not physical. But if it has been physical, as a lot of my colleagues fly around the world, that sort of level of material consumption, they fly around the world, they come back, they get the taxis out to their big houses in Wilmslow and say, we're doing something about the climate. The small percentage of the population, even in our own countries, who are responsible for the lion's share of emissions, need to go through radical periods of austerity and recession. The sizes of our houses, how often we travel, do we own cars, all of those things that we have normalized for our lives need to be questioned. And they need to be questioned because actually the thing that Robert didn't talk about, I mean, I agree completely on his approach towards efficiency and renewable energy and so forth. But the first pillar, the one that will first deliver, is we've got to get the emissions out of the system now. And that means reductions in consumption by those of us who consume huge amounts. That does also mean that poorer people, and this is why I think you can sell it to the greater population, well, you could if you didn't have the Daily Mail and the BBC, is that most people will be better off during this. They will see their emissions go up, their energy consumption go up, and their material consumption go up. And I want that. I want to see the emissions of poor parts of the world rise. I want to see the emissions of the 20% people living in the UK in fuel poverty. I want to see their emissions go up, because that means they're using more energy, that means their quality of life is improved. That means my emissions have to absolutely plummet. No more academics flying around the world, no more policymakers or business people or other senior people in our society who like to think that they add something special to our world. They are no more important than the dinner lady or the dinner man living in Cheetham Hill. And yet we have privileged our position. We have tried to think to ourselves and convince other people that there's something special about us that should allow us, this particular small group, to consume hugely. So when it comes to the Davos issue, I agree, it's about profits, but it's not really about profits, it's about their profits, or should I say our profits, because I benefit from Davos as well. So it's actually, even in something like Davos, it's about maintaining the status quo. In other words, that the resources of the world, the labor and the material resources of the world are held for a privileged few, and the other large percentage of the population take the crumbs off our table. And if that's what capitalism is, and we have to fundamentally change that, because that does not fit with the sustainability criteria we have. So though I agree with Robert's comments on the energy system, the first point, if we're going to resolve climate change, if we don't resolve climate change, it doesn't matter about the rest of the debate because we're going to hell in a handcart. The first part to solve climate change is that we have to get people like me to dramatically reduce my emissions and allow those resources of labour and material to be used to make the shift towards the decarbonised agenda that Robert's talking about. But I don't think at the moment we're prepared to open that debate. That debate is closed, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that brings us on to vested interests and the political class, and I'm sure that Molly, have a lot of experience with this. How do you go about doing that? How would you go about talking to the people who consume the most and getting them to concede on this point and reducing their consumption?
I'm kind of on both fronts there, because I think the European Parliament does good work, and it couldn't function unless people flew to get there. I mean, I don't fly myself, I travel by train, and so I agree that we have to ask serious questions about whether all carbon emissions are necessary, but I think political systems are necessary. I'm not an authoritarian. I'd love to be, but no, I don't think it would work. So in other words, you have to have negotiation. I think it's important that people are in the same place. But I do agree that a lot of these journeys are unnecessary, and a lot of the discussions could be done in virtual space, and we really should be focusing on that. But I think just to say, you know, people shouldn't fly around, they're not in, you know, I do think a flight that somebody takes to the United Nations to discuss the binding treaty on human rights is more important than somebody's holiday in Torremolinos. Maybe that makes me an elitist, but I do. But anyway, those are political discussions that we need to have. You're also quite disparaging about the carbon tax, which I think is a very good proposal. And I think a frequent flyer levy will really help, because at least that would stop Andrew Neil from flying back from New York, and we wouldn't have to put up with him on the telly. So there's an important side benefit there. But I mean, the carbon tax, especially if it's on the Hansen model, so then what you receive from the carbon tax is shared out and helps with inequality, would be a very good proposal. The European Union tried to agree that in 1992, but politically it wasn't possible, which is why we have the emissions trading system, which is very much inferior, although working better now than it was. But I think it's time to bring back the carbon tax proposal, and we're trying to do that now through the political institutions, because I think people are sufficiently freaked out now that they might accept that. So I wanted to say that, I mean, all I was trying to explain was some of these principles of capitalism, and why we do have this relentless growth, and why it isn't just a complete insanity, and why it isn't only about feeding the rich, although it is partly about that. And I think the problem we've got is that even though we can see that doesn't make sense, the problem is changing it into something else. And Herman Daly said this is like, you know, changing an aeroplane into a helicopter while it's in flight. And that's the point, because if you get something wrong, you know, a whole industry collapses, people at, you know, the whole of Hungary's up in arms or something, they vote for a fascist, your political system, you know, there's really serious risks here if we just say, okay, we're going to stop this now. So to me, the important thing that we have to do is to make these sort of transitional demands where we say something that looks like it makes sense now, but it's part of the new paradigm. So as an example of that, I would give you the citizen's income, because if people had a citizen's income and a secure livelihood, they wouldn't have to have that job secure in order to feel that they were comfortable and secure. So then the sort of need to keep creating those jobs and to generate the economic growth to make the jobs, that would be much less powerful than it is now. And that's the kind of thing we have to do. But you can't just sort of say, okay, and the other thing is the transition is really important as well. So this is what sustainable finance is achieving, I think. So coal is going to go, you know, obviously Poland is the main country supporting coal in a European context, but apparently they're agreeable to this agenda. So let's say there's 10% of the economy that's really dirty, and that's coal and fossil fuels and things like that, and then you've got the squeaky clean, green, renewables, lovely stuff. But the big bit's in the middle, and the real key to this is shifting the middle bit of the economy and creating the right incentives for, say, the cement industry to massively reduce the amount of emissions it puts out. If you look at where the emissions are coming from, most of the sectors that are producing most of the emissions in terms of industry will survive in some form. We'll still move around, but we won't be moving around in private cars that only last 30 years and run on petrol. We'll be probably walking and cycling more. We'll be having shared mass transit, and a lot of it will work on biogas and electricity. So I think imagining that transition and then thinking what the transitional jobs will look like is a really important part of this. But we also don't have to do all of that, because if we get the financial incentives right, since you can't do anything in a capitalist economy without having money to invest, or no, that's wrong, but most of the industry works, will follow that investment. So if we get the kind of design of the investment right, then we are beginning to shift the economy, and that's what we're trying to achieve. On the poor countries, I mean, I think that we must do much more in terms of technology transfer, because the good news here is that, as Robert said, as they move towards having electricity for the first time, reliable electricity supplies, that can come through renewable sources, so they don't have to go through the dirty phase we've been through and then change again. But at the moment, we're not investing in that well enough, and we're not sharing our technologies well enough. And last thing, just, you know, this idea, this is a sort of economist's idea that people are all looking at the TV thinking, oh no, growth's gone down, oh no. People aren't actually doing that. What they're thinking is, I feel poorer, stuff's more expensive, you know, my job's crap. So actually redesigning the system, economists would be really upset if growth went down, and no doubt Andrew Neil would as well. But mostly, people are not concerned about that. So we have to focus on what people really care about, which is decent hospitals and good quality jobs and so on, and focus less on the sort of theoretical aspects, I think.
Thank you. And yeah, Giorgos, you were talking about authoritarian capitalism, as you called it. And I do agree with you that a lot of that is done in the name of growth. And I do get what you're saying, that people are more interested in what's happening in their immediate in their immediate worlds. But I do think this narrative of growth is a really appealing one, and something that people feel is inherent, that good economics means growth. And I do feel like it has fueled this rise of authoritarian capitalism, as you call it. Have you got any more thoughts on that? Wonderful, thank you. I want to move the question. I really want to ask you a question, Kevin, because this is a particular interest of mine. I was really interested to hear you talk about the glitterati and the sort of lack of diversity of people who have massive influence over our economic systems. And at Rethinking Economics, we have a whole strand of work that's about diversifying the people that study and practice economics. I'd really like you to expand on that a bit and perhaps give us some suggestions I can steal about how we could maybe start to overcome that issue.
One of the biggest, I'm going to focus here on the climate change agenda, which is the one I know well. And some of you may be familiar that we have climate change models, which are basically just physics, just lots of maths and some basic physics. Then we have these things called, given the fancy title, integrated assessment models, and these are the really dangerous things. These are the most influential models at the political realm. These are what models that have a little bit of a sort of simplistic climate model, and then they have a major economic model in the middle, and it's a general equilibrium growth model. And that cannot be questioned. So you can question everything else around it. And these models are the ones, there's only a handful of them around the world, and they're generally run by wealthy, white, high-emitting men, with a few exceptions, but generally. And they have certain cultural things embedded in them, in the algorithms that are in them. And these produce sets of outcomes that give us very nice results that can be fitted in incrementally to the sort of Davos view of the world, so the Mark Carney view of issues of climate change. And we need to be questioning those models. I think we need to be dismantling them. And in fact, you touched on it, or Molly touched on it on the discount rate. These models have in them, typically, and it's been quite hard to get this out of the modelers, about a 5% discount rate, which basically means everything after 2050 doesn't matter. So what they've got, every single model run for 2 degrees centigrade, with almost no exception, assumes lots and lots of negative emission technologies in the future. These things don't exist, and they're going to be put in place by some of the younger ones here, because we'll all be dead, after 2050. But the problem with this model approach is that these are free, because they're discounted at 5% per annum. So you've got a choice in your cost optimizing model between a free technology in 2050 or doing something about it today. And of course, your cost optimization model will always tell you, I'll have the free thing in 2050, please. Now, the only reason that's coming out in every single model run, and this is not something that's abstract, this feeds into things like the Committee on Climate Change and the advice that they then give the UK government. And how come we can keep the same nice, sort of incrementally challenging messages to policymakers and to the public more generally. So we need to have economists in there from a different hue, ecological economists, ones who are not wedded to a general equilibrium view of the world, a neoclassical growth model view of the world, who start to find alternative ways to interpret the role that economics can offer. I mean, I think political economy had lots of wonderful things to offer. I think it's been downhill since 1870 onwards, as far as I can tell. Alfred's Marshall and partial equilibrium, fine. Everything post Jevons, Menger, and Volvers, no thanks. So we need economists to go back and revisit some of the wonderful stuff that went on up to about 1870. Maybe we'll let that out to 1920, but no later. And so I think there are things that you can be doing, that economists can be doing, to provide alternatives to these integrated assessment models, which, although most people aren't probably aware of them here, have been absolutely dominant in the climate change realm. And they partly feed into some of the discussion, some of the numbers that Robert's used in terms of what the sort of rates of reduction are. The rates of reduction are far more challenging than that. Imagine the US and the UK have to be zero carbon by about 2035, 17 years from now. So when we talk about a 40% reduction in 20 years, or doing something in 40 or 50 years, that's across the globe. But the wealthier parts of the world, we are talking about 10, 15, 18 years really sort of tops to be zero carbon. There's no way you can fit that in the current economic framing that we are using. And that's why ultimately this is come back to authoritarian, this is an authoritarian view of the world, but the alternative is also authoritarian. This one puts pressure on people like us, that the emitters. The other one, through climate change, puts pressure on the poor people living elsewhere who will be impacted by the climate change that we've imposed on them. Well, so the future is authoritarian.
Yeah. I would just like democracy to survive this process. So I think it's really important that we get agreement for what we're trying to do. And so when I talk about sustainable finance, I think that's me acting powerfully as a democratic politician, which is different to an authoritarian approach, which I don't think anybody wants, and I don't think it's necessary. Just coming back to your practical point, what do we do about the elites? I mean, I'm known as the crazy MEP because I don't fly, basically. There's one other, she's afraid of flying, so we're the two crazy MEPs. you know, so that's how bad it is. All the other people are completely oblivious to the fact that actually they'll sit there talking about climate change and then they'll fly all the time. So there's mass rank hypocrisy, and it irritates me like it irritates you. But one practical thing we can do is to require everybody who has any kind of expense account to also have a carbon budget. Because when I was an academic, I used to go everywhere by train, and I was a very expensive academic for that reason. And I think it was outrageous that I looked bad when they looked good. So if Manchester University isn't doing that already, it's not. It should be, and all universities should be doing that, and all public institutions should be doing that. And part of the point about the disclosure is we can say we want all companies to do that now, so they can tell us what their executives are doing. And if they're flying a lot, then we see that, because we see their carbon budgets. Yeah, then I wanted to just stick up slightly for Mark Carney, because Mark Carney actually started the whole sustainable finance agenda with a speech about the tragedy of horizons and how we weren't looking forward far enough. So although he is a very conventional economist, he does have children, and he actually has really kick-started this agenda, I think, in a useful way. Incidentally, just to say, coming back to the elites, the woman who, oh no, I always say she's a woman and everybody knows who she is. Okay, a high-level woman that I work with in the European Union. I raised this question with her about how we're going to regulate for the fact that there are all these stranded asset fossil fuel risks. And, you know, what's she doing about that? And she said to me, I have grandchildren. That was supposed to be enough. You know, she didn't know anything about it. She wasn't working on it, but she's now claiming some moral high ground for having grandchildren. So I have to say there is a lot of ignorance still and lack of action there. And I also agree with you about the modelling. Yeah, and this is where the work you're doing is so important, because we have to have economists who don't consider the model to be the be-all and end-all. Because if you create a model, effectively you're creating a black box, and 99% of people don't understand what's in it and don't even ask the question. And you come out with the number at the end, they don't understand what went through to get the number. And as you say, the assumptions behind the model are, in many cases, building in environmental destruction. But I have to say that with this work I'm doing now, it's kind of like people work, because we're now defining what is a sustainable asset in the economics committee. People are saying like, oh, you're a green economist. That sounds useful. So maybe it's changing a little bit rather than, oh, you're the crazy green economist. So I feel there are some signs of change there, positive signs of change.
Just on the Mark Carney point very quickly. Mark Carney gets £800,000 a year. And Robert quite rightly said, where do we get the money from? £800,000 a year? What's the median income in the UK? £23,000, mean probably £25,000. The point is that we are not short of resources. The resources go to a handful of people. Most professors in this university are paid between £68,000 and £100,000 a year. That's a disgrace, an utter disgrace. That is money that should be a significant proportion of that should be spent on us decarbonising this agenda. The problem is that people like professors and the Mark Carneys of this world, and the other folk that are on even higher incomes, the Al Gores of this world, we have normalised the things that we are. We think we are normal. But we are not, of course. We are abnormal, and we are taking a completely disproportionate amount of the world's resources. So whilst Mark Carney may say some interesting things on the finance side, he represents, to me, the fact that people like him think it's appropriate that he takes £800,000 a year of taxpayers' money that could be spent on the decarbonisation agenda. So that's why I'm very concerned about the fact is that the top end of that hourglass shot I'm showing is that's where the emissions are and where the resources are. If we don't question that, we're going to fail on climate change.
I did hear a terrifying fact about flights from London City Airport, where something like 60% of the seats don't get claimed. So big companies just book out the planes just in case they need to fly.
It's not all about flying.
But it's a scary thought.
It is, yeah.
So Robert Giorgos, would you like to come in on this point at all? I'm so sorry, Giorgos. Molly Scott-Cato has to leave at 5:30, so I do want to open up to the floor for some questions in case somebody wants to ask Molly one before she leaves. Yes? Any other questions? Yes, sir?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really strikes me is because we live in a democracy, or democracies around the world, one of the biggest obstacles to even putting into power the perfectly thought out plan is how you persuade others that this is actually a good idea. And it seems really strange to me that given that we're talking about the welfare of people's grandchildren, which normally has great emotional appeal to voters, why is it that we're failing to actually get across these ideas to voters to take them up? Because across the world people seem to be voting for climate change deniers. So, isn't how we package and persuade people these ideas make sense is one of the really crucial issues that we're facing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'll take one more question. Yes, sir? It's a nice succinct question. Okay, so Molly, I'll let you answer these. So there was the truth between degrowth and green growth, people with using caps on fossil fuels and material goods, and then how do we persuade people, how do we frame it so that people get on board, and how bad's the recession?
I've got an alarm set, so when that alarm goes, I'm going to run because I have to catch a train, and you'll find out what kind of music I like. How bad is the coming recession going to be? I mean, after 2008, that was capitalism's biggest failure ever by a long way. And what they did was printed masses of money through QE and shoved it out there to keep stuff going, right? So we were effectively already in that recession. It's just that it's being kept afloat with masses and masses and masses of crazy non-existent money. So the traditional way that capitalism's grown has already stopped. We just haven't really adjusted to it yet. And most of the people that are running this financial system know this, but they can't find a way to turn the airplane into the helicopter. That's my view. So I don't think the recession need be bad at all, because I think people have far more than they need, actually. It's a question of redefining what makes a good life. You could spend a lot more time in the pub and whittling and all sorts of things that you might enjoy. I mean, I love going to the woods and bodging myself, so I'd spend a lot of time doing that, grow food locally, but you wouldn't be able to have a holiday in Torremolinos or a new phone every year. But to me, I mean, the last work I did was about the bioregional economy. It was about exactly this point. People are not happy. That's why I've got that guy standing on a pile of plastic crap, right? So it's mostly about changing that mindset, which takes me to the question about capitalism. When I was doing the Extinction Rebellion in London, I went to have some lunch while everybody was sitting in the road because I got hungry. And when I came back, I couldn't get the bus through. And I said, what's going on? They said, oh, some people protesting. I was like, oh, who's protesting? Oh, yeah, Extinction Rebellion. Anyway, so then I had a chat with the bus drivers, two guys in their 50s, London bus drivers. And they said, what's going on down there? And I thought, oh, shall I just not say anything? Or shall I, shall I go for this? And I said, I'm 55, since I was born, 60% of the species on Earth have gone extinct, and we're not doing anything about climate change, and I'm totally sick of it. I said like this, and they said, we're with you. Both of them, just like that. So I think that people are really worried about this, and they're ready for much more dramatic action. I mean, obviously we should do something about the lies and neo-fascist propaganda and so on that dominates we need to change the way media is owned and controlled so that we have a fair and open media, and that would really help. But all the same, people are freaked out about what's going on and they're ready for change, not just on climate change, but because they know it's a tragedy. They know we're killing species on Earth. They know effectively we're killing our life support system, and they're ready for people to take action on it. That's why 24% of people in Germany say they'd vote for the Green Party. And you know, if we had a fair voting system, I don't think we'd be on 24%, but I think we'd be way ahead of where we are now. And our platform is very radical on all this stuff, and so is the German Greens platform. Beth's question on caps. I think there's two ways of looking at this. If you're going to have caps, you then have to persuade people that that's a good idea. And that would be an extremely difficult political battle, and you'd have a different political battle on tungsten and on, you know, all the different minerals. And my own view is, this is why I'm doing sustainable finance, because I think it's a more efficient way of doing the same thing. Because if we can regulate to say, I don't think people should be using this mineral because it's much more efficient to use that mineral. Or, for example, you know, there's render now which absorbs carbon dioxide rather than producing it. We just have to say within 10 years, companies that are using the old style render can no longer have a financial value. They will shift then, but we don't have to manage the whole economy for them. So it's the difference between saying we're going to have a sort of command and control economy where I have to decide, but I have to convince all the millions of people in the country, or just convincing the market to get on with it, but very strong framing of the market. And I think the second one is actually, I think it already is working quite well, and I think it's ultimately more efficient and faster.
Thank you. Giorgos, do you want to come back on any of those questions? Robert, I'd like, if you want to come back to what Giorgos was saying, but also if you could address the questions that was asked in the room. Thank you. And Kevin, do you want to respond to the questions?
Yeah, well, I agree on the first point about setting caps on things. Certainly the area that I work in on climate change, I think we could be setting caps. And in fact, that's what carbon budgets are. They're a cap. And you know, what I'm saying for financial instruments, because the EU already uses these sort of things anyway. If you look at our cars, there's an emissions grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre. If you look on power stations, there's already discussion about grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. So I think there's a lot to be said for setting the caps. And if we could set the caps across all the planetary boundaries, and if you want to include some social boundaries in that as well, in theory at least, and I quite like this, and that's one of the reasons I use the word post-growth, I almost wish we didn't discuss growth. I'm really not interested in this thing called growth. It's completely abstract out there. Now, whether it's, you know, if it's growth in female literacy, marvellous. You know, if it's growth in arms sales, not quite so good. So it's the things that are important. Let's value the things themselves, not always financially value, mostly not financially value, and not worry about whether it's growth or not. So let's try where we can to set the caps agenda. And ultimately, a lot on climate change, ultimately this is a rationing issue. You know, we have to ration out the limited amount of carbon that we have left. And I still don't think any of our discussions really, to me at least, hasn't understood the scale of the challenge that we face, that in almost no period of time, we have to make dramatic reductions in our emissions. And that's because we have chosen to fail for 28 years. And the we in that, it doesn't mean, I'm specifically talking there about, you know, the elites like myself who have not pushed the agenda hard enough, not talking about most people living their day-to-day lives who have not engaged in this. So on the first point, I think caps, I prefer that approach to a carbon tax route. The carbon taxes, other than the fee and dividend approach that people like Hansen talks about, whereby the money is collected from related to our purchase of fossil fuels and then spread out evenly to the rest of the population. There's some merit to that one. But other carbon tax approaches that most people talk about, people like me will be able to simply pay them, and the poor will have to have even greater levels of fuel poverty. So I'm concerned about that. On the democracy one, I think it's a really interesting point. And actually, I think to some extent we can bring in Robert's comments and Molly's together there, that actually the great thing about the transition, the physical transition that Robert's talking about, is it does have a huge jobs requirement, whether that's retrofitting the rubbish houses we have in the UK, or whether it's moving to more electrification or you know, more renewable energy and so forth. There's a huge jobs agenda there for the next 2 or 3 generations. And I think you can, as long as that is done justly, and I should say I did used to work in the offshore industry. I used to design and build offshore oil platforms. And the friends and colleagues I still have in that industry need to be making that transition from what they're doing now. But they have the skill sets that are necessary for us to be building offshore wind turbines and trams and all the other things that we require to decarbonise industry. So to me, the big problem about the democracy here is that democracy is unfortunately being fed, and it is changing with social media, which I think overall I'm in favour of. But it has been fed by a small set of elite people that have run the media. And they do not want us to think this is good to make this transition. Most people will be better off in making this transition, as Robert rightly points out. The problem is a small cohort won't be, and they have dominated the media for so long that they have wanted to undermine that agenda. And I think you can see exactly that with something like the Daily Mail. Paul Dacre will be seriously affected by climate change. He will have to go through a personal recession and reduction in consumption. But the people who read the Daily Mail won't be. Most of those will be better off. So I think there are ways to bring these things together from a democracy point of view. So I'm trying. What was the final comment?
How bad's the recession?
How bad's the recession going to be? Well, the problem with recessions, they always affect the poor. I mean, any professors here that have noticed austerity in the last 10 years since 2008? Not one of us, I would guess. And this is always the same. You know, the sale of private yachts has gone up since the 2008 banking crisis. And we have to start to recognise that recessions are things that generally affect the poor. And that's why I said the devil is in the detail. You've got to unpick these things. Who is being affected by them? Overall, a recession is a bad thing for society. But a recession for people like me is a really good thing. And then Giorgos mentioned, why do I pick on academics? I pick on academics because we have a particular privileged position in society. We are, and okay, these are all cliche terms, we can change them, we can modify them a little bit, but broadly we're there to try and do objective analysis, recognise we get it wrong from time to time, speak bluntly, speak truth to power, and we have not done this on climate change. You know, there have been some exceptions here and there, and Giorgos is clearly one of those, but the negative emission sort of ruse that's been running for 10 years, academics have stayed quiet about this. the dominance in integrated assessment models of a particular economic model. And I have read a lot of other about a lot of the other economists, Robert, but you go to Working Group 3 of the IPCC, and that's the one on mitigation, about reducing our emissions, and it's completely dominated by general equilibrium neoclassical growth models. So I know lots of other people talking about other models. They're not there in Working Group 3. The academic communities remain quiet about this. We remain quiet about the equity dimension of all of this. And it's had lots of nebulous arm waving for the last 20 odd years. And it's because we want to get funded by the research councils, who have also had, all the research councils in the UK have had in their strategy documents that the research must feed into economic growth. Every single research council. So if you're doing work onto earthworms, you've got to show how your work on earthworms is going to feed into economic growth for the UK. And we have stayed quiet as academics. We have been supine, we have been pliant, we have been party to maintaining the status quo. So yes, there are lots of other people we can criticise in society, but I think our job in society, paid for by the public purse, is to have much greater honesty and integrity. That will mean, of course, we have lots of disagreements still. But honesty and integrity, I think, by and large, in the climate change realm, the climate change academics have sold out on this. We are mitigation skeptics. We accept the climate science, we do not believe we have to do anything about it. And on the end about moralising, this is all about moralising. Climate change is a moral issue, and there is no non-moralising approach. You can't have a non-moralising approach. So let's hold our morals, put our morals on our sleeve and hold them up. This is what we stand for in various forms. So we need to bring morals to the fore. It is not about 2 degrees centigrade, it's about science, it's not about carbon budgets. It's about a moral framing that needs to be clear, and we can have our discussions and our different interpretations of it. But if we hide behind some nonsense objectivity in this, we're going to carry on going down the same route that we've had with the same set of integrated assessment models, producing the same set of astrological numbers. So I think on that I'll leave it.
Yeah, I think that we would maybe be more successful at the framing and how we bring other people on board if we spoke in moral terms rather than numbers and big words that nobody understands. But yes, another round of questions? Yes?
So I think the debate has kind of shifted away from capitalism to growth, and I think the question is it like, and I think, yeah, some of you have reflected critically on like, is it really growth? Is it really growth that we need to care about? And like, I think maybe I would invite everyone to go back to the question of like, is capitalism unsustainable, and maybe move away from the question around growth, because I think capitalism is not growth, and growth might not be the root cause of the problem. And then also we kind of focus on climate, but then there's other kind of environmental challenges, and so I think and then also maybe relating to caps, like even if caps worked on reducing climate change, it would, like, can we implement caps on everything that we would need to regulate? And then I think just like some issues that relate to the structure of capitalism, such as the ownership structures and the need to make profit, like if that continued, then we could have still have other ways of making profits that are not carbon heavy, but might be equally destructive in environmental terms, but also in social terms. And we talked about inequality a lot. I think this is also privatization of water and land and the air with carbon markets now. I think capitalism is super flexible. So I would really invite you to go back to capitalism.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, sir?
I might be a simplistic economist, I don't know, but probably the most important intervention I've heard of to combat climate change was the suggestion that we should have $50 to $100 per tonne on each ton of carbon burned. That was brought in by Nicholas Stern, who you're saying is part of the glycerol. I don't know, I've got no view on him particularly at all. But that doesn't seem like incremental to me. I use that in my work. And I think it's probably the number one way that we could combat climate change. And I'm wondering why you appear to be denigrating it.
Okay.
Not on his discounting, he was very brave. But on his carbon tax, I disagree. But,
Yeah.
We focused a lot of the conversation around energy consumption today, and it seems like another thing to do that possibly hasn't been brought up because we glossed over on one of the slides was the carbon effects of intensive farming production and how changing all of our diets is probably going to be a fundamental part of this conversation. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that and more plant-based diets and stuff.
Okay, so the first question was bringing us back to the original name of the debate, so about capitalism being unsustainable. And broader than that was talking about the other environmental challenges that we face. And is it possible to put caps on absolutely everything that we need to regulate? And the other question was on Stern's recommendation of $5,200 per tonne. And then not just energy consumption, but how we consume food and plant-based diets and intensive farming. The fact that we've got no topsoil left. And yeah. So, Robert, would you like to start us off?
Sure.
Thank you. Giorgos? Thank you. That was a bit terrifying. Kevin, over to you.
Well, the capitalism one, you know, I'm an engineer, not an economist, though I've spent quite a bit of my PhD trying to understand economics. But I think, again, it's a nuanced issue. Is capitalism, is what we see in Sweden, where I spend a lot of my time working, the same as what you see in the US? I think to describe them both as capitalist economies is too simplistic. There are significant differences in how countries operate and the economic structures they have within them. And there are elements, no doubt, which could be called as capitalism, but other things that are somewhat different to that. So I think we have to maybe unpick it a little bit as to quite what we mean by it, if we really end to say whether it's a good or a bad thing. You know, I don't like the whole concept of usury, as far as I'm concerned. If you're people should be fairly paid for their work. If you're fairly paid for your work and you decide not to spend all your money at some time, you shouldn't get some interest on that money. It seems to me that's fundamentally wrong. If you're paid, you get fair access to resources for your work, and then you get these extra set of resources for doing nothing. Because if you remember, if you're paid fairly in the first place, and then you make money for investing your money elsewhere, then that is money you're getting for doing no work. Now, it seems to me I got a Yorkshire Moments, you don't do out for out. And it seems there's something innately wrong about the idea that you make money for doing nothing, provided you were fairly paid in the first place. Why should I get access to more resources? So, and given that sort of partly fits into the whole sort of concept of capitalism, I'm uneasy about that. I don't like the whole idea of a usury. And I take the point about things like framing some of these issues around monopolies and privatization and all that sort of agenda. But I don't want to live in a society that's completely nationalized, whatever we might describe it that. But the idea that you would privatize natural monopolies like water, and some, in retrospect now, I think telephony, perhaps we should have privatized, perhaps much later. But at the time, that was also a natural monopoly. We did that with numerous natural monopolies, both the Conservatives and the Labour government. I think that was a real mistake. And the public lost out, as they did with the quantitative easing. There was a huge transition of resources from the public purse to the private purse of the few. And QE was exactly the same, quantitative easing was exactly the same like that, again, taking public money and handing it to a handful of individuals. So I do think we have to question the whole concept of what we mean by capitalism and unpick it a little bit more. When it comes to dollars per ton, I take Robert's point. I mean, I mentioned Hansen and other people's versions of this idea of fee and dividend, and I'm happy with Robert's interpretation of taking 50% of it to invest on infrastructure. That seems fine to me. But the idea of a $50 to $100 a tonne that you spoke about, we've seen more than that in the rise of energy costs, but we've not seen reduction in emissions. So the problem is that those of us that emit can simply afford to pay for it. So a lot of things have gone up by a higher amount than that on the energy realm than that amount of carbon tax, but it hasn't brought about the equivalent reduction in emissions. And so therefore, I think the arguments that Stern and others were making, that was the right sort of number, is actually flawed. The work we've done I've done with some other colleagues on shipping, so that even at $2,000 to $3,000, euros, we would say, 2,000 to 3,000 euros per tonne, you would start to only just make a difference on the price of goods that were transported. At 2,000 to 3,000 euros per tonne. And the problem is here again is that that it's not just about the price. There's something much more embedded in that, and also the price is something that some can afford and others can't. So I think, though I think price may have a role to play, so it might have a role to play in the emissions trading scheme in persuading someone to go for a certain type of gas-fired power station or maybe an offshore wind system. That the marginal cost differences may be important there, but I don't think you can use it for the system level changes we're talking about. Remember, the problem with what we're facing is a system that is far from equilibrium, and we're looking for massive changes. The problem with the economic framing, the neoclassical framing, is it's somewhere near equilibrium, believed to be somewhere near equilibrium, and you're talking about marginal changes, small changes. So you would never use theories of laminar flow in aerodynamics to understand turbulent flow. You would never use quantum mechanics. Sorry, you'd never use Newton to understand quantum mechanics. So why do we use neoclassical marginal economics to understand non-marginal change far away from equilibrium? No other field would do that. So that's why I think it tells us a lot about competing socks companies on a high street, but it tells us nothing about the sorts of global issues we're talking about in relation to climate change. So price may be one mechanism you use, but it's dominated the discussion so far on climate change. Nick Stern was very brave on discount rates that Molly talked about earlier. He countered a lot of the common views amongst his discipline. In arguing for something approaching a 0% discount rate, which I think was really brave of him and important. On the farming side, you're completely right. 20-25% of the emissions of the warming we've seen, rather, has come from the non-CO2 side, principally related to agriculture, the CH4 emissions and the N2O emissions, so both sorts. And even if we move, well, what we need to do, we know what we need to do on food. We can do all the efficiency stuff on food, but it gets completely dwarfed by moving away from eating ruminants. Animals with 2 stomachs, we should not be eating. Now, as a vegetarian, I would argue, perhaps, we shouldn't be eating any of them. But anyway, but I'm just from an emissions point of view, or from a temperature point of view, animals with 2 stomachs are a problem. That's sheep and cattle, because they ruminate and they pump out lots of methane. If you move to pigs or chickens, then you can probably get somewhere between a 50 and 75% reduction in emissions simply by making that move across. And then if you can make move across to a plant-based diet, you make bigger reductions as well. So whilst I could make a moral argument why we should be vegetarian or vegan, if you don't want to take that argument, you can simply take the point that if we move away from eating anywhere near as much meat as we do and have it occasionally to that now, and preferably very little red meat, then that would make a big difference. Then there are also the efficiency things that we can do within this sector itself. But you will always get some emissions of methane, and you will always get some emissions of N2O from agriculture. Even if you use organic fertilizers, you're going to get N2O emissions probably about the same sort of level, roughly, as with artificial fertilizers. So they will always be quite high, and if you're interested in the numbers, probably somewhere about 6 billion tons of CO2 equivalent every year. You're not going to get rid of those out of the system, which is why you have to have zero carbon energy. Coming back to the point about forestry, it's really important, but the final comment that Robert made there, I would disagree with. It is not simple. And the problem with the integrated assessment models is they almost all use forestry along with negative emissions. And in Sweden, they're actually saying we're going to grow our Arlanda airport near Sweden, near Stockholm, and they're going to do that by planting more trees to compensate for the CO2. That doesn't work most of the time. Because when you plant, firstly, afforestation, planting on areas that have not had trees on for a long time, often means a lot more emissions from the soil than would be captured in the trees itself. So the soils are incredibly complex, so you can't simply plant trees and think that's good for carbon. It's not necessarily. Forest restoration is really good. Forests that have been chopped recently, the soils are still normally in quite good conditions, and forestry management of the forests that have been very badly looked after and denuded, you can do a lot of carbon capture in those. But let's not think this is simple. And it is not an excuse to allow us to build more high carbon infrastructure elsewhere. And that's what it's been used for in the integrated assessment models. So I think let's be cautious about any of these silver bullets, whether it's negative emission technologies, whether it's biomass, whether it's afforestation. These are often used as silver bullets to allow us to carry on with the status quo. So I'm not saying we should be opposed to them, but let's look at them more cautiously. They are never simple.
Thank you. And I'm afraid that it's 8:05 and it's Sunday night, and that is all we have time for. But I would like you to join me in thanking our incredible panelists. And thank you all so much as well. Thank you, Robert and Giorgos. Thanks for joining us over the web. Bye.